And without further ado, opposing the motion, Christopher Snowden.
Thank you very much. It's unusual to have to debate a point of fact, and to do so I'm going to have to list a number of facts. I will come to the basket of goods measure already mentioned there, but I am going to talk about incomes because I think it's rather important if you're going to be talking about poverty to talk about people's incomes. There has been a steady and historically unprecedented increase in the wages of British workers for at least the last 150 years. Estimates are around an 8-fold to 9-fold increase. This, of course, has not gone totally uninterrupted. There have been stagnations in wage rates at various times and small declines in wage rates. 1970s, middle of the 1970s, the early 1980s, early 1990s, and of course, most recently during and since the recession of 2008, 2009. Since wages rise and fall in line very much with productivity, it's inevitable that there was a reduction in wages, which we're only now, as news came out today, has shown now recovering from. Average earnings for full-time workers were 7.5% lower in 2013 than it had been in 2009. It's true. Initially, in the first 3 years of that, the poorest 10% saw slightly larger declines in their wages than the richest, although that was reversed between 2011 and 2013, when the richest decile saw actually the biggest declines in their wages and the poorest saw the smallest. Now, as painful as these recent trends in wages have been, it is unlikely that the last 5 or 6 years will be remembered as anything other than a blip in the upward march of progress. The bigger picture is very clear. Since 1975, and all the figures I'm using here, by the way, are from the Office for National Statistics, and they're all, of course, adjusted for inflation. Since 1975, average wages for full-time workers has doubled, 101%, and nearly doubled for part-time workers. Amongst the poorest 10%, full-time wages have risen from £3.40 in 2013 prices in 1975 to £6.67. Part-time wages have risen from £2.83 to £5.83. Or to put it another way, currently only 2% of full-time workers earn the minimum wage of £6.19, or last year rather, £6.19. If you compare that to 1975, adjusting for inflation, 45% of the entire workforce was living below what we now consider to be the minimum wage. And whilst 30% of full-time workers earned less than £10 an hour in 2013, 85% of workers would earn less than that in 1975. That's wages. That doesn't tell you everything about incomes, because there's an enormous amount of taxes and benefits that go into it as well. So let's look at incomes. If we look at household disposable incomes, i.e. income after direct taxes and benefits have been taken into account, we see very much the same story in rising prosperity. Between 1977 and 2011/12, the incomes of the poorest 20%, the bottom quintile, rose by 93% in real terms. Those in the top quintile rose even more. It's true, 149%. So clearly the rich have got richer, but it's also clear that the poor have got richer. Even during the 1980s, when there was a large increase in inequality and there was a huge increase in the number of people unemployed, real incomes of the poor still rose. In recent years, state benefits have played a major role in cushioning the poor from the impact of declining wages during recessions. That's certainly been the case over the last 6 or 7 years. The fall in earnings has largely been due to inflation rising at a faster rate than nominal wages since the recession, but benefit payments tend to actually cushion the poor from the effect of declining wages, because benefit payments are fixed to inflation. They're not fixed to wages. And the result of that, as the Office for National Statistics records, is that disposable incomes fell by 4% between 2007 and 2012. That is less than the rate of wage decline. And that, and I quote, "The largest fall in incomes over this period has been for the richest fifth of households, whose disposable incomes has fallen by £3,300, or 5.2% in real terms. By contrast, the Office for National Statistics says the average income of the poorest fifth has risen by £400, or 3.5% since 2007/8. So it is inarguable that the poor have become richer in the long term, and doubtful that even in the last few years they have become poorer. Now, critics sometimes move to other measures of poverty when the income statistics clearly show that they're wrong about the poor getting poorer. One is relative poverty, which is generally defined as being 60% below median incomes, tells us nothing about the material living standards of the poor. In 1979, 13% of the population was living below the relative poverty line. By 2005, by which point the incomes of the poor had gone up by more than 50%, the relative poverty rate was 18%. To put it another way, the incomes of the poor increased by more than 50%, the relative poverty rate increased by 50%. Over the last few years, because median incomes have declined, you've seen the relative poverty rate decline. This is very much like, it is essentially a measure of inequality. And during tough economic times, inequality tends to fall because everybody is getting poorer, with the possible exception of some of the poor people who are on benefits. I'll come to the basket of goods measure. There's nothing wrong. At the Institute of Economic Affairs, we kind of support the idea of having a basket of goods to measure people's living standards. But to compare them over a period of years, period of 30 years in the case of the PSA measure, is to compare apples with oranges. Now, it may very well be the case that today there are more people who can't afford 3 necessities in this basket than there were in 1983. The point is, it's a completely different basket. You're not comparing like with like. Joanna says society has changed. Yes, society has changed. It's become much richer. And the basket of goods reflects the fact that the poor are richer. If you look at some of the things in the list, and not all of these are actually considered necessities, but they're all in the survey to ask people whether they can afford them or not. If you look at some of the things, comparing 1983 to 2012, 6% of people in 1983 wanted a washing machine but couldn't afford it. That's fallen to 1%. 22% of people in 1983 wanted a car but couldn't afford it. That's fallen to 10%. 11% of people wanted a telephone but couldn't afford it in 1983. That's fallen to 2%. A night out once a fortnight, fallen from 17% to 9%. Christmas celebrations, fallen from 4% to 1%. A week's holiday away, fallen from 22% to 5%.
That's not true.
There are various things in the list today, which, as already mentioned, weren't even around then. Fair enough, society's moved on, we become richer, that's okay. But let's not pretend that people have become poorer just because they can't, just because society now expects people to have things that are associated with wealth. So computers, mobile phones, dishwashers, second cars, all not included in the list. 19% of people today say they would like a second car but can't afford it. A plasma or high definition LCD TV, 10% say today that they would like one but can't afford it. And things that have been taken off the list of 1983, because presumably everyone now has them, include carpets in the living room and bedroom, indoor toilets, baths and fridges. Now, you have to ask yourselves why, ladies and gentlemen. If the poor have got poorer, why is it necessary that the definition of poverty has to be expanded and broadened and made more inclusive? Why is it we don't talk about absolute poverty, we now have to talk only about relative poverty? Why is it that the basket of goods includes a whole range of things that weren't on there 30 years ago because they were considered luxuries? The reason, ladies and gentlemen, is because the poor have not become poorer. Everybody has become richer.
And seconding the motion, you've got 4 minutes. I'll tap with 1 minute left.
Yeah.
Is Sean Dolan.
Right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, my name's Sean and I work for a conflict prevention NGO. Poverty really, really matters. We're only ever 3 meals away from desperation, and through the studies that I've done at the NGO, I can tell you that poverty starts an awful lot of wars. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what he said before I get on to what I want to say. He's done a bit of an intellectual sleight of hand here. He's saying that incomes matter more than what you actually buy. Because I'm just going to look at a couple of things that people need to live and measure how they've gone up. Well, if you live in London and you decide to do something radical like live in a home, then wages haven't kept up with your rent for a long, long time. If you want to be even more radical and heat the home that you live in, which is another crazy concept, then you're stuffed again because there have been real term increases way above wage rises in that regard too. And if you're more radical and you've decided, actually, I'm not going to live in a home and I'm not going to heat the home I don't live in, but I'm instead going to eat something, which is another radical concept. If you like chicken or beef, and despite what he said that tastes have changed, people have eaten chicken for a pretty long time, then again, your stuff, chicken, beef, vegetables, all gone up faster than wage rises. The fact is that the poor are getting poorer because they're being clobbered by what the Labour leaders termed a cost of living crisis. But the fact is the basic things that we need to live are getting more expensive, so their incomes are going down. But really, I think the poor have really been attacked on two fronts. They've been attacked by the companies they work for and the government they have. Really bizarrely, I used to live in Newbury, which is a lovely place, but I did have a not so lovely MP called Richard Benyon. He's the richest MP in Britain, and he lives in a 255 bedroom mansion called Inglefield House. Now, under the current tax system, my mum, who lives in a 2-bedroom house in London, which is pretty modest, let's face it, it's, 2 up, 2 down thing, pays more council tax than Richard Benyon. Now, council tax is meant to be property tax, but it's simply ceased to work if somebody who lives in a 255 mansion pays less tax than I do. So the poor are getting clobbered by council tax, which isn't fair on them. They've also had to face a VAT rise. Everything that I've talked about, well, not food actually, but quite a lot of things that people buy have gone up enormously. And this is a poor that is uniquely on poor because, believe it or not, poor consume an awful lot, and there's only so much stuff that a rich person can eat or consume. But if you're on the bottom end of the scale, you're going to get hit harder. But you get hit harder even worse because chances are, if you want to live in a social home at a reasonable rent, there's not many of those left either. You also probably have to cope with something called the bedroom tax, which overwhelmingly falls on people from poor backgrounds. If you are one of these people who might be disabled, now those disability benefits are now much harder to get. We've had really perverse incentives where people have actually been diagnosed with brain cancer, are dying, have been found by Atos to be fit to work, and then have died before they can start the job that they've got. This is a system that victimises the poor. The governments have cut jobs, they have cut pay, they have cut hours, they have cut pensions. All of these people impact the poor the most. But it doesn't really end there because they're not just victimised by the government, they're victimised by companies too. More people now are on 0-hour contracts. They've had to do with below inflation minimum wage rises. But I think the biggest problem of all is the mechanisation of the workforce. People on unskilled jobs are simply becoming less valuable. And this is something that I can't unmake technology, but this is a very big problem because the value of their labour is only going to get down, and that's only going to get worse for them. So what have I told you? I've told you that simply that people do live in poverty, because if you live in a home and you eat stuff and you heat your home, chances are you're worse off than you were 10 years ago. And the fact is that you're under attack by your government in the taxes it levies and attacked by the companies in the work paying conditions that you have. That for me is an enormous problem. I hope it's a problem for you guys too. Thank you very much.
And seconding the opposition, we have Jonathan Lee.
Thanks, Marcus. Okay, well, a couple of you guys mentioned that generally a 10-year time frame, but I'll kind of maybe go back a bit longer than that. But I'd begin with a quote from Paul T. I was looking through the Global 21 Meetup Group for inspiration. He said, the poor have allegedly been getting poorer since the dawn of time. One would imagine that they would be pretty damn poor by now if that were true. And again, I'm just pointing out what Chris was referring to, the ONS, Organisation for National Statistics, the very own government-run service. I've got slightly different stats, but again, it supports the, they're talking about, in July 2013, they're talking about disposable incomes generally have fallen since the start of economic downturn, but they've got a different stat here, but they say the average income for the poorest fifth has grown over this period by 6.9%. So if we're talking the poorest of the poor, then those stats don't support that. Again, this current government, they've cut taxes for the lowest paid. There's 3 million people out of income tax altogether. People don't start paying tax now until they've earned £10,000. There's also a freeze in council tax. Okay, everyone has to pay council tax, but as Sean said, but still it's a freeze. We've got a minimum wage. Again, that's been above inflation rise in the national minimum wage. I mean, these things aren't great, but they're still, the poor are better off than they were before in that respect. And then we mentioned consumer goods and all the rest of it, and I think the general material well-being, if arguably maybe not over the last 10 years, but over a longer time frame has gone up massively. And the material abundance of things now that unimaginable to previous generations of the poorest in society. And it's not unusual for a typical poor household to have all the best consumer electronics, or maybe not the best, but decent stuff that most people have anyway. The video game system, PC, smartphone, microwave, As Joanna said, there's people have fridges and all the rest of it. And also there's software, and there's the internet now. There's the market-leading technology, open source technology, software as a service, social media, all the market-leading cutting edge technology, IT and comms technology is pretty much freely available to all, which again was unheard of a few years ago. Again, material stuff. We've got flourishing of free food provided by the food banks. On top of that, ever cheaper supermarkets. You now got Lidl, which anyone can buy a whole lobster, albeit it's frozen, for just £5. Fantastic if you like lobster and you previously wouldn't be able to afford it.
No.
Many of the UK's poorest are overweight or obese. How does that come about? Have time and money to gorge themselves on a high-calorie diet of whatever it might be. They can also take advantage of foreign travel and cheap package holidays, again, which was inaccessible a few years ago. I was on a holiday in Canary Islands a while back, and I met a couple who just live off their benefits over there and have a lifestyle of doing no work but living, roll up special brew, getting a daily lobster tan again, and then they were just, when I met them, they were travelling back from a trip to the UK to go to the NHS where they get free healthcare. I've got so many points to make, but okay. Let's see what I can pick out. But I mean, there's also social mobility. People have always been able to raise themselves above. There's not some static, poorest class. You have White D, who's maybe a bad example, but with a little bit of endeavour and maybe more luck, is now a hard-working celebrity superstar, providing entertainment value for the masses. And someone like Alan Sugar is someone who grew up on a council estate, is now worth 900 million quid, according to Wikipedia. But I think generally there is the whole squeeze middle, and the people who actually work in the real economy, who are earning a living in the open market and all the rest of it, they're definitely worse off. But the poorest, get pretty incredible, benefits that end up. The discussion about the benefits cap is, way in excess of what even the average income of if somebody working hard every day to provide value and goods and services in an open market for other people. And I think maybe our main ire shouldn't be directed at the whole discussion about the maybe on the benefit class, as you were, but there's also many people at the top of society who benefit from a fraudulent financial system, thieving bankers, they're puppet politicians, public sector bureaucrats, speculative activity, low interest rates, rent-seeking activities. All of this is contributing massively to devaluing the value, the product of people's labour, who are working hard to some way involved in delivering goods and services, which I think is the main issue, the main problem.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan.